Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon. And thank you for joining us for today's event. I want to first begin by thanking the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation for co-hosting today's event with the Brookings Institution. My name is Ryan Hass. I'm the director of the China Center at Brookings. But more importantly for today, I'm the moderator of our event. And with the APEC leaders meeting looming 1 week out, and the expectation that President Biden and President Xi will meet at that event, this is sort of an important opportunity for us to take stock of where things are and what we should expect when the two leaders sit down together. What will be the implications diplomatically in terms of the security situation on Taiwan, regional security, as well as broader strategy. And I'm thankful that we have some of the brightest minds in the world with us today to help us think through these challenges. Oriana Skylar Mastro is a fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and also a professor here at Stanford. She also serves in the Air Force Reserve. Patricia Kim is a fellow at the China Center, as well as the Center for East Asia Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. She is an expert on Chinese foreign policy, as well as the politics and security in East Asia. Colin Kahl is a senior fellow in the Freeman Spogli Institute, a former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the Pentagon, an alumni of the Obama White House, where he and I first had an opportunity to work alongside each other. And of course, Gita Wirjawan is a visiting scholar at Stanford. He is a former Indonesian Minister of Trade, and he is widely recognized as a man of many abundant talents.
Too long.
Notice you didn't say that about the rest of us.
So with that, I just want to get us started. The way that we're going to proceed is I'm going to ask these panelists a few questions to get the conversation going. We will reserve time at the end for your questions, your answers, your reactions. So please feel free to organize your thoughts. But to get us started, I was wondering if I could just ask all of you, if you could identify what do you think are the top 1 to 2 factors that will drive the narrative around the meeting between President Biden and President Xi? What will determine whether or not it is optically viewed as a success? Colin, can we start with you? Maybe we'll work our way around.
Sure. I mean, to some degree, simply having the meeting is the purpose. I think there's a lot of anxiety around the world about the deterioration in the U.S. China relationship. I don't think the meeting is going to stop the fact that there's a lot of competition and a lot of tension between Washington and Beijing, but I think the world is looking for a signal that the world's 2 leading powers are committed to putting guardrails around the relationship so that competition doesn't turn into conflict. So I think in part the meeting is the message, but I do think it'll be interesting to see if a couple of things come out of the meeting. One is what did they say about the ongoing conflict in the Middle East? I'm sure that President Biden will continue to press President Xi on restraining Iran and its allies from entering the conflict. I think, the United States and China have very different perspectives on the conflict, but I think they share an interest in the conflict not expanding beyond Israel and Gaza to engulf the rest of the region. So I think people will be looking at that. I don't expect a lot of public messaging on Ukraine, but I suspect this will be a topic that the 2 presidents talk about in private quite a bit, where Biden will continue to press Xi on not providing significant support to the Russian military effort in Ukraine. I'm sure they'll talk about other issues as well, clashes with the Philippines and around the Second Thomas Shoal. There's a whole host of issues. And the only other thing I'll say publicly is we've got a couple of things going on in the last week that I think it'd be interesting to see if they get highlighted. One is there was an enormous amount of activity around artificial intelligence last week. The artificial intelligence executive order, you had the G7 statement, you had the Declaration of Principles on the responsible integration of AI into military systems that was signed by 31 countries, but not China. You then had the UK Safety Summit, which generated a statement that China did sign onto. And so there's just a lot of momentum around norms and principles for AI. And I think that, again, this is an area where competition between the United States and China is fierce, but arguably they have a shared interest in preventing some of the worst, low probability, high impact existential risks that might emerge from some of these large AI models. So it would be interesting to see if that makes it into the public domain. And then lastly, there is, for the first time in a number of years, a Chinese delegation in Washington today to discuss arms control and strategic stability, which has been a big theme for for Biden when he's met with Xi in the past. I don't think we should expect anything meaningful to come out of the meeting, but the fact that they're having the meeting is important because, again, I think the world is looking to see whether the two military superpowers can start to have a framework for conversations around these things.
Great, thank you.
So I, generally speaking, I agree with what Colin said, and I do believe obviously having the meeting is more progress than not having it. But I also think it's kind of like a couple who's decided to get divorced, but they show up to Thanksgiving and still haven't told any of their family members. I mean, the fact that the purpose of this is to signal to the world, like, that the world wants the stability in the relationship, and we're going to show up and we're going to sit side by side, and like most of these meetings make some sort of positive statement. I think, to me, I would not be reassured if I were the rest of the world. It seems a bit empty to me. Now, of course, I have a few categories of the low end, high end of how successful this meeting would be. Of course, what they're saying is just meeting is success. So on the low end, basically, there are no real deliverables. On the higher end, you have some deliverables, but the nature of those deliverables, I think, will tell you how successful the meeting is. So first, there's like sort of non-traditional versus traditional security stuff. I think if they're going to get anything done, and maybe they don't make this in terms of a public statement because it's not as sexy as some of the other issues, but some of the things that are being thrown around are things like establishing more direct flights between the United States and China, agreements on fentanyl and other concerns that the United States might have. These are sort of more non-traditional areas that don't open up a whole Pandora's box of more sensitive issues that if the Chinese and the Americans wanted to show goodwill, there is this viewpoint that I don't necessarily agree with, but this viewpoint that you can build goodwill at these lower level issues, and maybe somehow that will trickle up and help us with the more serious ones. The second category I'd put things is global versus regional. So I think it would be good if there were discussion of some of these global issues like the conflict in the Middle East, but from the Chinese perspective, those are less hot and button issues than the regional ones, right? So if you talk about the global issues, China right now is trying to present itself as a purveyor of global security goods. I was just in Beijing last week for this defense forum, which is basically a couple of days of Chinese propaganda. And they talked about the conflict in the Middle East more than they talked about Taiwan, as a way to demonstrate that the United States is not a responsible global leader, but China will be. So I'll also be looking for that balance. Like, are they gonna say sort of anything about, the South China Sea, Second Thomas Shoal, and obviously the hot button issue of all hot button issues, Taiwan. And the third thing is, in the context of those issues, is either side going to acknowledge the concerns of the other, or are they just going to parrot how their position is the correct position and the other side is right? So kind of the content and tone of any statement being made. And the last thing, which doesn't suggest that it's a complete success, but it's something, is whether there's a commitment to a sustained agenda of meetings moving forward. So as long as the Chinese continue to use cutting off of dialogue as a strategic means of demonstrating when they're unhappy about things, even if the Chinese, like this time, say, okay, we're gonna meet, if there's not a lot of warning, there's not a lot of prep time. We have whole bureaucracies that are designed to prepare our leaders to say, this is the deliverables we want, this is the information you have. And if we never know if the Chinese are going to show up until the last minute, I think that does restrict in the long haul what we can get done. So those are a few of the factors that I'll be looking at.
Thank you. Patty?
Very well. I think Colin and Oriana covered a lot of ground. I think, as they both say, everyone will be watching to see sort of the meeting for the tone that it sets for the U.S. China relationship and kind of hints about what to expect from the relationship in the coming months. I think the Chinese system will be watching for whether Xi is treated with respect in the United States that befits the head of a great power, that he isn't embarrassed or comes away looking like a supplicant, especially since he's coming here to the United States, rather than the other way around. I think in the US, there will be scrutiny around whether President Biden makes any seeming concessions or promises to Xi at the expense of US interests and the interests of allies and partners. And so that's where sort of the scrutiny will be politically. The challenge is, I think, the US and China have traditionally had very different views on what are the best practices for stabilizing the relationship. Here in the US, there's this tendency to put a greater focus on building practical guardrails that could reduce the risk of escalation, like strengthening communication between both militaries, and on advancing cooperation on global challenges such as climate change or arms control. Whereas in Beijing, you often hear, the US first needs to acknowledge China's core interests on Taiwan, promise not to undercut the legitimacy of the CCP by criticizing China's human rights records, for instance, or, and so on and so forth. And if the US does this, then anything and everything else is possible. That's where they often start. And so I think this is really a difference in American and Chinese styles of doing business, where the Chinese like to set a broad framework and tone for the relationship and then talk about specifics and mechanics, whereas in the US, we're often keen to start with more practical steps and see that as an ability to build trust and momentum. I think the political systems on both sides are cognizant of these differences, and no one has illusions that the demands of the others will be fully satisfied and that we can negotiate away all of our differences. I think there's a lot of reality on both sides, especially now. And so in terms of whether the meeting is judged a success, I think if both leaders are able to give a nod towards the other concerns while avoiding the potential pitfalls and criticisms in their home systems, the meeting would be judged a relative success.
Yeah, as a Southeast Asian, as somebody who's attended the APEC summit 5 years in a row, starting with Singapore, Yokohama, Honolulu, Vladivostok, and Bali, it just appears to be like so many of the other multilateral meetings. And I put this in the context of how we Southeast Asians have viewed multilateralism significantly on a decline in the last, I would guess, decade or so. And we're sort of like viewing the United States as a country that finds it very difficult to embrace multipolarity. And I try to, basically raise the awareness that, ironically, in a much more multipolar world, multilateralization becomes much more difficult. And I got a good taste of that as a trade minister entering into discussions on RCEP and much less the early stage of TPP, which unfortunately didn't happen. I get the sense that, and I share, I think, the views of many of my Southeast Asian fellows, that the United States finds it very difficult to embrace multipolarity. And I'm fully cognizant of the fact that history has always been filled with multipolarity. And at the rate that the United States will find it difficult to embrace multipolarity, it might get more exhausted than necessary. And having seen the security concerns taking place in Ukraine and recently in West Asia, we in Southeast Asia are even more concerned now that there's not a whole lot of bandwidth for the United States to be allocating for purposes of peace and stability. So those are, I think, some of the things that are occupying the minds of many Southeast Asians at the moment. Now, I do agree with the other participants that I think the bar is very low for the meeting between Xi and Biden, but I do have a wish list. And the wish list, I think, consists of two things. First is really AI. AI is, I think, a subject that's filled with hallucinations that are being pumped with hypnosis that I think don't lead up to anything benign and judicious at the rate that it's not being attended to in a much more multidisciplinary manner. The second would be sustainability. And I've raised this paradox of sustainability where the narrative of sustainability is something that's just a little too elitist. It resonates to only 10 to 15% of the population of the planet where the rest are just only concerned about putting food on the table. The demand side is easy. I can socially re-engineer anybody to stop using coal as long as there is an alternative that's affordable. The problem is there isn't. The supply side is also doable from a technological standpoint, but not from an economic standpoint. And this is where I think my wish would be that conversations between the two most powerful people in the world would try to figure out a way so that the economics would work out for 80% of the planet. So that's really where I am right now.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that in a moment, but before we do, Patty, can you help us understand why the meeting between President Biden and President Xi is taking such, what is making it such a high visibility?
Well, this would be the first time that Biden and Xi would be meeting since they met last November on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Bali. At that time, the two presidents had agreed to manage competition responsibly, to empower their deputies, to open channels of communication, and to look at ways we can cooperate on climate change and global food security and so on. And I think the meeting was seen as a good solid start to stabilizing the relationship, but of course, everything came to a halt after the Chinese spy balloon crisis in late January. And so since then, since the summer, we've seen a steady effort by both sides to resume diplomatic engagement and build momentum towards this leader-level meeting at APEC. We've seen Secretaries Blinken, Yellen, and Raimondo go over to China. And I think these efforts were motivated by a recognition in both systems that without stabilizing the relationship, without regular dialogue, and without better channels of communication, there is a real chance that we can stumble into a military conflict, whether in the Taiwan Strait or in the South China Sea or the East China Sea, where Chinese, US, and US partners are operating in close proximity to one another. And any US-China conflict out there would be catastrophic, not just for the US, but for the entire world, and China, but for the rest of the world. And in addition to any casualties that would result from a military engagement, I think some sort of US-China standoff would essentially trigger the full decoupling of the US and Chinese economies, which is something that we've tried to avoid, even as both sides look to de-risk and to reduce their dependencies on each other, given how costly full-scale decoupling would be. And if there were to be some sort of confrontation in the Taiwan Strait, for instance, half of the world or more of trade passes through this area. So again, everyone would be affected. But even without getting to such extreme scenarios, I think if the US and China fail to work out a functional relationship, the fact is that many global challenges would go neglected, whether we're talking about climate change or regional crises like the Middle East, where, Colin, as you said, the US and China have different positions and don't always have all the same interests, but nevertheless still have an interest in preventing the spread of conflict, and they don't want to see a prolonged war or certainly the humanitarian impacts of the wars that are going on. So I think we've seen some positive momentum in the recent weeks with several groups like the Financial and Trade Working Groups meeting for the first time. There's the dialogue on arms control or strategic stability that started up for the first time since the Obama administration. And it'll be interesting to see if there are any other hints of other working groups that might be stood up after the two leaders meet. But I think, again, the most important result of this meeting would be sort of a signal by both sides that the leaders are committed to putting the US-China relationship in a more stable and constructive trajectory. And I think this is really important, especially in a top-down system like China, where President Xi, what he says and how he describes the US-China relationship really sets the tone and the direction for the bureaucratic apparatus in China. And of course, I think the real test will be whether this momentum can be maintained in the months and years after this meeting, or whether things will fall apart again if there's some other crisis, which there inevitably will be. And there's certainly no shortage of potential friction points with the elections coming up in Taiwan, our own elections around the corner. And of course, the two countries sort of operating in close quarters out in the region. And so there's a lot of reasons why it could fall apart. I don't know what the answer is for creating durable mechanisms. It'd be interesting to talk about what that might be, but yeah, I think that's where I would leave it.
So Patty introduced the risk of incident that could escalate and be very difficult to control. In recent weeks, the Department of Defense has begun publicizing examples of unsafe and unprofessional intercepts. And the Chinese have reciprocated with their own evidence of what they claim to be unsafe American maneuvers. Why, Colin, help us understand what's going on here. Why is this happening now?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, part of it's happening because the volume and velocity of these incidents is going up dramatically. So, a couple of weeks ago, the DoD put out its annual China military power report. There was a briefing that Assistant Secretary Ratner, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Indo-Pacific Security Affairs, and Admiral Aquilino did at the Pentagon, particularly calling out these unsafe and unprofessional intercepts. And, U.S. documentation suggests that in the last 2 years, there have been 180 unsafe and unprofessional intercepts by PLA forces, just of U.S. aircraft. If you add on allies and partners like the Australians and the Canadians, you get close to 300. That is more than in the entire decade prior to those statistics. So, and so much so that the Pentagon at least has come to the conclusion that this isn't rogue pilots. This is an intentional act by the Chinese leadership to basically introduce what Thomas Schelling would call the threat that leaves something to chance, right? That basically if you operate, even if you're operating in international airspace, and all of these incidents are happening, let's be clear, over international waters in international airspace. These are not US spy planes intruding on Chinese territory. But China's reaction is that our activities in their neighborhood is provocative, and they're introducing friction and risk into that as a way to try to box us out. And the challenge, of course, is that that's not going to work because the U.S. military and this administration, any administration, is going to be committed to sailing and flying anywhere that international law allows the United States to do so. The world recognizes that right. This is not China's sphere of influence. This is international territory. So there's a real risk that you could get an incident. And I'll just highlight two examples. A year and a half ago, you had an Australian manned reconnaissance aircraft flying over the South China Sea where a PLA fighter aircraft came right over the top and released flares and chaff back into the engine of the Australian aircraft. That could have been a deadly episode that would have immediately implicated U.S. treaty obligations with one of our closest allies in the Indo-Pacific. And then just a couple of weeks ago, you had a PLA aircraft that came within 10 feet of a U.S. B-52 strategic bomber flying in international airspace over the South China Sea and flew at high velocity under the wing. Extraordinarily dangerous. So I think there is a real prospect that if the PLA keeps this up, something can go bump in the night between the world's two leading military powers, and in a very different context than the last time this happened back in 2001, where the politics and the geopolitics of this are much more complicated, much more fraught, and much more tense. So the reason I think that the Pentagon is highlighting this is to put the world on notice of what the PLA is doing. So that when and if an incident happens, and the U.S. will do everything possible to avoid such an incident, but that the world understands the history behind this. Because frankly, if an incident happens, whether it's with the United States or an ally partner, managing that scenario what will be really critical is that it's not just Washington versus Beijing, that actually the international community is focused on this and focuses on the parties to de-escalate and focuses on getting access to crash scenes. And there's a whole bunch of scenarios in which it is as awful as this will be, it will be better if the international community is focused on it and is not immediately made a US-China thing. The last point I will make is, and we start off with the Biden-Xi meeting, the US has repeatedly pushed the PRC to thicken crisis communications mechanisms. This is not, this is, a lot of times this is talked about in terms of like hotlines, as you know, Ryan. We have phone numbers. There are secure and non-secure. It's not about telephones and whether we can, it's whether anybody on the other side will pick up the phone. And the problem is they won't. I remember, we reached out repeatedly around the spy balloon episode to include right before we shot it down to arrange calls between our Secretary of Defense and the Minister of Defense in China, and crickets, nothing. They didn't want to talk to us. And it's extraordinarily irresponsible. It's extraordinarily dangerous. And, if China is going to be, think of themselves as a great power and a world power, it's, to quote Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And so they have a responsibility. They have a responsibility. Actually, I think it was Peter Parker's uncle that said it, but in any case, they need to grow up. And act like a mature power. Now, their answer when Americans make these complaints is kind of twofold, which is you want crisis management mechanisms so you can have more crises. It's like it's a moral hazard argument, right? Like you want seatbelts so you can get in more car accidents, which last time I checked is actually not why we want seatbelts. But the other part of it is they have a retort, which is common, which is, if you don't want crises, there's a simple answer: get out. Like, you are not a Pacific power, which is strange because we're sitting here in Stanford along the Pacific Ocean, and I grew up in California. So yes, we are a Pacific power, and our allies and partners are all over the Indo-Pacific that we have obligations to. But China's regular retort is exactly that. So I think the until China kind of changes that fundamental perspective and is willing to pick up the phone and have mature conversations with us, even in areas that they disagree with, we're going to run the risk of a serious incident.
That's very sobering. Gita, you were talking a moment ago about America's fatigue with multipolarity and about your hopes that the meeting between Biden and Xi can introduce progress on AI and sustainability issues. You also know many of the Asian leaders well. So if you can put yourself in the office of various leaders throughout Southeast Asia, as they're watching President Biden and President Xi meet, what do you think they're going to be looking for to measure how it impacts their interests or their priorities?
I can speak for Southeast Asia. I can't speak for anything beyond, but we're all looking for money. That's what matters, right? This is a region that's not been good at attracting foreign direct investment, with the exception or absolute exception of Singapore, which has been the LeBron James when it comes to FDI and trade. But put this in the context of how the collective trade of ASEAN or Southeast Asia with China has grown. It's at $1 trillion right now. The only thing missing on the back of this massive trade accumulation, growing at about 15% per annum, is the lack of capital formation. So you talk to anybody in Southeast Asia, with the exception of anybody in Singapore, they would hope for this massive liquidity that's sitting in the United States and China to be allocated. But the irony with that is that the financial allocators have fiduciary responsibility, right, to the financial capital holders. And they can't allocate this capital without being accountable for good results or bad results. So the onus is partly on our side, where we've got to get our act together. But the problem is, all across the world, we're witnessing increasing political neurosis at the developing level and at the developed level. And that makes it tough, for conversations between developed economies and developing economies, as we're seeing some degree of political neurosis here too. So the United States and all other Western liberal democracy countries are flushed with more than $100 trillion worth of liquidity. That's a lot of potatoes and apples, right? And Boeings. You can take advantage of that for purposes of making sure that Southeast Asia becomes a modern nation. And this takes us to the sustainability point. You know, countries like India and Indonesia will need about 100 years to become modern, just to raise electrification from 1,300 kilowatt hour per capita to 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita. I'm using 6,000 kilowatt hour per capita as the definition of modernity. And you need to be modern thinking to be able to understand the narrative of sustainability. That's not going to happen in a clean or environmentally friendly manner until and unless somebody in the developed economy goes, wow, we need to allocate this capital. Technology is there. But here's the other challenge. If you take a look at the fiscal space of developed economies, including here in the United States, I mean, the portion of the budget that's required to service the debt is already in excess of 20%, already in excess of defense budget. So you've got fiscal constraints in the United States and many other developed economies, and you've got more fiscal constraints on the developing economies. So I think this is a long game. If we were to sit here and expect that, you know, some short-term solutions are going to be attained, I think it's going to be unrealistic. So the key is to infuse realism in the discussions on sustainability and also artificial intelligence. I don't think that's going to kick in anytime soon until and unless somebody wakes up. Boy, this is going the wrong way.
Interesting. One of the issues that I expect will be prominent when President Biden and President Xi sit down is Taiwan. And Oriana, you've spent a lot of time talking about, thinking about, writing about cross-strait issues. What do you expect the Chinese are going to bring to the table with President Biden, and how would you encourage him to respond?
The first thing I will say is the Chinese don't like to have exchanges on Taiwan. You know, so I don't think the Chinese goal here is like, why don't I sit down and have a conversation with President Biden about Taiwan? Because the way that they think about this political issue is it's an internal issue. So kind of what the United States has to say about it is the United States should have nothing to say about it. It's kind of their version of what Colin was talking about with the South China Sea, of like, everything would be better if you were just out. I mean, I will say when I was in Beijing last week, a lot of my Chinese interlocutors said that exact message to me, expecting me to push back. And I said, you're absolutely right. Like, you say that the United States is the reason you, like, the world is not the way you want it to be. That is correct. The United States and our presence in Asia, it is the buffer that allows countries to pursue what is in their interests and not completely capitulate to Chinese demands. So on the Taiwan issue, I don't expect Xi Jinping to be like, okay, like, let me hear your views about Taiwan, President Biden, but I do expect him to make some pretty strong and serious sort of one unidirectional statements that will at the very least come out in any of the outbriefs in the Chinese media. You know, things like, you know, anyone the United States thinks is going to keep Taiwan and China apart, you know, they are wrong and they will pay, you know, an ultimate cost for these types of things. I mean, Zhang Youxia, who's the second highest military leader only under, you know, Xi Jinping on the Central Military Commission, made those types of statements last week at the Xiangshan Forum. So I think, like, that's the first thing to kind of keep in mind, is they are trying to warn the United States in no uncertain terms. And this is a lot with the military activity. Increase in activity is not only just in the South China Sea, but we also see significant increases in military activity around Taiwan. And in my discussions with the Chinese military on this, it's extremely clear. This is their new version of peaceful unification. It is to show the island of Taiwan that there's no other option. Not the social and cultural exchanges between the two sides has led to such affinity that the people of Taiwan want to be a part of mainland China, but they see the writing on the wall, there is no other hope. And so China is really trying to convince the United States to get out of this issue, just like the South China Sea, because if we abandon Taiwan tomorrow, you better believe there is no way that Taiwan has any hope of possibly defending itself, not even against a full, you know, PLA military invasion, but against any form really of Chinese coercion. And so the leadership would have to rethink. In terms of, you know, so what is she trying to achieve at this meeting? I think it's just going to be the standard critique. And also a deep warning maybe in these private meetings that the direction of US policy, which some aspects, I would agree with the Chinese assessment, are designed to keep Taiwan an independent entity. You know, not in law, but de facto, trying to support Taiwan in many cases, you know, reduces the likelihood that these two sides will come together, warning the United States that those activities and policies, whether they be legislation, in the United States, visits by high-level officials, that those are extremely dangerous. And that Xi Jinping, doesn't want to fight a war over Taiwan, but he will. And if this becomes a war of necessity, not only will China use force against Taiwan, but it will be the fault of the United States. So just to piggyback off of what Colin said, the US perspective is to highlight some of these issues in the South China Sea and Taiwan so that the international community understands the context. But we also have to keep in mind that China is doing exactly the same. Because historically, when they're going to use force, they like it to be very clear that they were patient, that they warned many, many times before they did it, such that when they do use force, they say, this is completely legitimate. You are the one changing the status quo. You are the one threatening our security. We warned you so many times. We told you so many times to stop doing it, and you didn't do it. And so I think in that context, those are the types of statements that we're gonna see coming out of Xi. And I'm sure, Biden, I think, I had a recent op-ed in which I argued unpopularly that I think in addition to the very clear warnings that any Chinese use of force will be met by a US military response, there also has to be some reassurance messages that not only is the United States does not support Taiwan independence, but we are not against unification. I wouldn't say we're for unification. I think that is a bridge way too far. I mean, most people even think any sort of statement saying we're not against unification is a bit of a bridge too far. But just to be fair, that is the official US policy, that we're not against unification. So if we can sort of normalize that type of message so it doesn't seem to be such a punch in the face in Taipei when we say things like that, I think that would be a useful way forward.
Well, I'm committed to getting everyone out of this room onto the rest of their day by 1 p.m. Which means that we have about 20 minutes left. I want to give each of the panelists an opportunity to react to anything that their fellow panelists said, but also any other issues that they would like to put on the table before we open up the floor to our audience. Oriana, Colin, Gita, Patty, anything that you felt like you wanted to respond to or add to?
I just think Gita's hit on this a couple of times. I think that the U.S. China rivalry is happening against the backdrop of two technological revolutions that are going to change the world. The way we interact, the way we live, the way we develop. And those two technological revolutions are the artificial intelligence revolution and the revolution in clean energy technology. Everything about our world will be different a couple decades from now through some combination of those two things. And there is no way that the United States and China are not going to compete around those technological revolutions. The United States and China have very different views about how the world should literally be wired. And as we digitize everything and artificial intelligence gets introduced into that, there actually is a competition of systems here that will be profound, and we shouldn't sugarcoat that. But both countries should have a common interest in preventing the existential risks that emerge from artificial intelligence. And I would identify the bio risk that emanates from these technologies, the systemic and democratized cyber risk to critical infrastructure that emerges from these technologies, any interaction between artificial intelligence and nuclear command and control, and then the prospect that accumulating gains and advances in artificial intelligence lead to an artificial general intelligence that is untethered from human goals, objectives, and control. And China doesn't have an interest in any of that stuff happening. Neither does the United States. So can there be some narrow cooperation, just like the two superpowers cooperated to eradicate smallpox at the height of the Cold War, or the nuclear nonproliferation regime to contain the proliferation of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union cooperated on? So is there a version of that in AI? And likewise on clean energy, what is there a narrow slice of cooperation that remains possible on climate change without, it can't be that China says, you have to give us everything we want on Taiwan, and then we'll cooperate with you on climate change, which is asinine, because it pretends as if it's a gift to us to help address the climate crisis, when the climate crisis is an existential threat to China too. The United States should not have to give China anything for them to cooperate on China change and on climate change. And oh, by the way, we shouldn't expect anything in return either. There should be zone for cooperation on climate change because it is an existential threat to both of our countries, separate and apart from some bargaining space that we have between us. So we'll see if there's any room for cooperation that emerges in the coming years in these two areas of existential risk.
I would just like to add, you know, in terms of what we expect in terms of this meeting and the future of the relationship. You know, for China, the U.S. relationship was the main show and has been the main show for decades. Even when they didn't like us, even when we had our ups and downs, there was always this viewpoint that their relationship with the United States was the foundation of everything that they wanted to achieve in the economic, military, and political spheres. I don't think that's the case anymore. It seems like, and this was not only, you know, the past 2 times, I guess, in the past month or so I've been to Beijing, it really seems like now we are the sideshow. And the main show more and more is China's relationship, in particular with the developing world and the rest of the world, and at least trying to equalize those things to create a balance with the relationship with the United States, whether it be sort of economically, this idea of like, okay, if we have a conflict with the United States, if there's any sanctions against us, you know, we don't want to, the Chinese are thinking they don't want to be so reliant on the US, so reliant on Europe. You know, what about other countries? What about trying to create markets in other countries, you know, for their trade? And so, you know, it does, when I was at Shangshan, it was obvious that all that messaging was not for us. You know, there were like 4 or 5 Americans there. And there were 3 Brits that we found, and we kind of like, you know, gathered together. But what really stuck out to me, and to be fair, I interact a lot with the Chinese and a lot with the US government, but I don't really interact a lot with the rest of the world. And so this might just be my ignorance, and then everyone else in the US government really has it together. But I'll say it anyway. I felt in many cases, a great discomfort with dealing with those countries that were there in Beijing. Like, I'm not used to going to lunch and like the Taliban is there, and the Iranians are there, and the North Koreans are there. And then, you know, others that have their own qualms about US policy, whether it be the Nicaraguans and Latin America, those from Timor-Leste, like everyone was really unhappy with the United States. And of course, I know that there are these narratives in some of these countries, but for that to be the majority of the voices, I just thought, we always talk about the United States having to improve its game in the rest of the world, as 80% of the world lives in developing countries. But I think in some cases it's hard for us to do that, because the Chinese, it's not even like they felt uncomfortable. They're like, ugh, I don't like dealing with the new government of Afghanistan either, but I have to for strategic reasons. I mean, they didn't even seem to notice when they were kind of floating around. And then the second thing is, in some cases, not all, but there was a bit, you know, at Shangshan, a bit of an amateur hour. And so I'm also not used to, like, how are we supposed to deal with certain governments that don't have the same kind of standards of professionalism or rules of the road or what have you as we do. So, you know, I work on U.S. China relations, so I don't have any ideas for this, but it seems like this idea that the United States needs to really focus on having a set strategy for the developing world, that needs to be a key part of how we manage sort of China's role in the world. And that should be in addition, so that we can also sort of speak more broadly about issues with the Chinese and their impact, even beyond the conflict in the Middle East, beyond technologies. They are now having an impact everywhere in the world, for better or for worse. And I think the United States wants to have some say in that.
Again, I'll speak for Southeast Asia. This is a region that hasn't had more than 9 million lives lost in the last 2,000 years by way of differences of views or opinions with respect to ethnicity, religion, or race. That's a tiny number compared to what we saw in a span of 35 years in the 20th century, the early part of the 20th century. So this is a region of peace and stability. And our interaction with China for the last 2,000 years has been predominantly commercial, not militaristic, not a warfare. So when I hear you guys, and I'm probably going to be on a limb here, because you know, the conversation is about power, right? And I think there are many of us in Southeast Asia who perceive the Chinese as having gone in the last 120 years from being kicked around to now, hey, dude, we're going to be the largest economy in the world in the next few years. Whereas at the same time, the United States has gone in a matter of 10 to 20 years, the last 10 to 20 years, from being the only police, judge, and executive branch leader of the world to having to deal with this much more multipolar kind of world. And I would argue that China, I think, has been able to live in a multipolar world much longer, much better than the United States. So the adjustment for both sides, I think, will take time. And I would argue that the Southeast Asians, I think, have been a little bit disillusioned some years ago on the back of this pivot to Asia. Forgive me for saying that, because I went through that, right? The expectation was so high. I mean, you were there. I was on the other side. We were hoping for, the candies. Never arrived. We thought we entered Toys R Us, about to get lots of candies and whatever. So it was just, I would also argue, and this touches upon the politics of things, in the history of Southeast Asia's interactions with the US, we felt transactionally better whenever there was a Republican leadership in the US. I don't know why. I think it's probably because the Republicans, they tend to be much more entrepreneurial, and the Southeast Asians are transactional. They want to be entrepreneurial. They want to be transactional about this. So the shaping of Southeast Asia going forward in the context of this great power politics is to make sure that, we're going to get engaged by the United States so that we could leverage all that for purposes of getting a better deal with the Chinese and vice versa. But at the moment, it's the Chinese that are allocating more goods and services and capital.
I want Patty to come in, but before we move, does that comment that you made about comfort with Republicans extend to 2020? Or would it extend
Next year?
2024? Does the same logic apply?
He's got a lot of
or is
friends
it-
in Indonesia. I'm talking about the other guy, not the current guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's got a lot of friends in Southeast Asia.
Okay, that's interesting. Patty?
So reacting to some of what's been said, I think Oriana, what you laid out about Xiangshan, I think that completely shows that China has been investing more and more in the global south and in developing world to build up its own strategic allies and partners, just as the US has been investing a lot in strengthening our relationships with allies and partners. And, I think China gains a lot perhaps diplomatically, but it also creates risk for China, right? And when things go up, people are going to expect China to respond, but I don't know if it's ready to do that. And also, I think it creates vulnerabilities where rogue players can try to play off China and the United States, and this could create perverse incentives, and you see that going on today. In terms of, we talked about sort of what does China want out of this meeting when it comes to Taiwan policy, thinking about what will the people in Taiwan be looking at. I think they'll be looking very closely to make sure that President Biden, characterizes U.S. Taiwan policy, or that he doesn't seemingly make any concessions or promises that conveys weakened U.S. support for Taiwan, or any sort of endorsement of Beijing's aim for unification. And I don't expect that to happen, but of course they'll be watching very closely. But at the same time, I think the people of Taiwan would also be very alarmed if the meeting doesn't go well, and that there's no serious indication on either side of this desire to stabilize the relationship, because the risks of conflicts have high stakes for everyone involved, especially the people of Taiwan, who would most certainly be hit the hardest if there were to be some sort of conflict in the Taiwan Strait. And I think these, kind of considerations reflect how we talked about Southeast Asia, how U.S. allies and partners in Northeast Asia are often thinking, right? They're often sort of afraid that U.S.-China relations will swing to one extreme or the other, that it'll get too sort of cozy and that, that the US and China will create a G2 and they're going to call the shots while leaving everyone else on the sidelines. It's hard to imagine this kind of scenario here in the US, given the state of US China relations. But believe it or not, when Henry Kissinger went over to Beijing this summer, we got asked by a lot of Asian diplomats, oh, is this a sign of some sort of rapprochement or reset in the US China relations? And so there's always that kind of concern. And of course, there's a concern that things swing too much in the other way, where the US and China are on the brink of conflict. And so I think people will be watching from around the world to make sure that the sort of the right balance is struck. And I think that's what sort of the Biden administration has done. They've been very clear that the US intends to stand firm on its values, stand behind allies and partners, but at the same time to work towards a more constructive relationship with China. And that's the tone that should be taken.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left. If anyone has any questions that they would like to raise, please feel free to raise your hand now and I will call on you.
I am Josh Kalanick, visiting scholar here and an Army officer from the War College. So Colin talked about this competition happening in the context of the sort of an AI revolution. Central to that AI revolution is the need for semiconductors. The Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company produces something like 60 to 70% of the most advanced chips. The US has been very proactive about trying to deny China access to advanced chips through export controls, et cetera. I'm just wondering, how much does the semiconductor market factor into the United States and China's calculus on Taiwan, whether how proactive we would be in defending it versus their calculus on unification as we compete going forward with AI?
Great question. I'm gonna hold on that for 1 second to see if anyone else would like to bring it on the table, and then we'll give our panelists a chance to react.
Dan Snyder from East Asian Studies here. So given the internal situation in China, particularly the slowdown in the economy and whatever ramifications are still there in terms of the way that COVID was managed and so on, how much pressure is there from within China on Xi Jinping, both first, even just to have this meeting, but also to have a meeting that produces some kind of easing of tensions between the United States and China? So I mean, what sort of pushes Xi Jinping to the table? I think you've talked a lot about it from the other direction, but not so much from there.
Gita, you talk about AI and sustainability, and I'm a AI researcher myself. I know that 2019, United States had a almost not 800 pages long National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence. From that report, the top issue is artificial intelligence education, AI education. And the Stanford actually produced a report that from the AI talents perspective, United States ranked number 13, unfortunately, we're not number 1. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on what do you mean exactly AI? Do you mean AI education?
Okay, so why don't we go around the horn here? We have 5 minutes left and give everyone a chance to react to those questions. Colin, we'll start with you.
So I just on Josh, to your point, look, I think that a lot of the world sees the Taiwan issue as either a regional issue or, for some that lean towards the PRC perspective, as an internal Chinese issue. It's a global issue because of Taiwan's role in the global economy. 70% of all microchips, 90% of the highest end chips. Then you also factor in Taiwan's geography, which sits astride the South China Sea and the East China Sea, and the amount of trade that passes through there, the overall role in supply chains. Any conflict over Taiwan would lead to a global depression that shaved off trillions and trillions of dollars from the global economy. It would make COVID and the Russia-Ukraine conflicts look like economic blips. So the world has an incentive to not have that status quo be changed forcefully by either side. And that is the US policy. It is not Beijing's policy. Beijing's policy is to coerce Taiwan into capitulation, and if that proves impossible, to seize the island by force, and that would destroy the global economy. Whether the United States entered that conflict or not, it would destroy the world economy. So we have a collective human race interest in peace across the Taiwan Strait, and it's time for more countries, whether it's in Southeast Asia or in Europe, to put skin in the game on that, and not pretend that they can keep their head down between the two superpowers and the collateral damage is not going to happen to them. They may not care about the Taiwan crisis, but the Taiwan crisis cares about them. So they need to focus on it, and we all need to work collectively to prevent it from getting really bad.
The three of you having, I know you have a specific question addressed to you, but
I'll just say maybe something about the pressure on Xi Jinping.
Yeah.
You know, I have written extensively about how I think the threat of China, not right now, but maybe in a few years, of taking Taiwan by force is real, but none of it is about internal pressure on Xi Jinping. It's not like Xi Jinping is like, oh, I really don't want to have to deal with this Taiwan issue, but people inside are pushing me in that direction. I actually think the biggest threat comes more from assessment, confidence in assessments and their strength, especially military strength, than it does in insecurities. And I would say, you know, China doesn't really have this history, and I don't really see it there of any sort of diversionary type of tactics. If things are bad economically, and they're so bad that like people are on the streets and the party is threatened, I think China really hunkers down, and we will see a lot less activity. The only sort of caveat is if countries like the United States try to take advantage of that period of time to push our own interests, then China tends to respond extremely aggressively because they have this narrative of the number one thing that leads to collapses of dynasties and maybe governments is the combination of internal instability and external pressure. But I will say that generally speaking, Xi Jinping has showed us with his COVID policy and with a lot of other things that it's not always the case that prosperity is more important than power and other national interests. And so like Colin said, the idea that he'd be willing to pay an economic price for Taiwan, I think is indisputable. The question is, what would that price be? I don't think he's willing to risk, you know, an economic collapse in China, but, you know, a 3 to 5 year decrease in GDP by 10%, I think that would be on the table. So the real question is, how much can we create a situation that makes it look like the economic costs would basically be the end of China as we know it versus just painful for a couple of years and then they'd be able to recover.
okay, we're at 1 o'clock right now. So if you have final thought, please.
I agree. I don't think he's doing it because of this whole pressures, because as long as there's nobody on the streets, as long as it's growing at about 2 to 3%, he's going to care about other things. But going back to AI, I'm in a camp that believes that AI, with all these hypnosis, they ought to be multidisciplinary. I'm in a camp that believes that AI ought to be open sourced. It ought to be not for profit. I think we shouldn't rush ourselves to be in a camp to be for profit and closed source, because we don't know, you know, what the perspectives of spirituality, economics, environment, philosophy, all the other things. I think this needs to be ushered forward in a highly multidisciplinary manner. And if I take a look at some governments, you know, they're very different in the way they're treating it. Japan is sort of like opening up the old kimono. Singapore, I think, is a lot more judicious. They're a lot more guarded and measured. Now, to put this in the context of Southeast Asia in terms of how this could be value additive, I'm on the board of, you know, a couple of AI related companies in Southeast Asia. I think we're going to see a massive inflection in the next 5 years where we're going to be able to see 100 million people in Indonesia being able to speak English. You know, at the moment, not more than 5% of the population. That's only like 5 to 10 million people. But in the next 5 to 10 years, can you imagine if there's 100 million people in Indonesia that can speak English? If there's 400 million people in Southeast Asia out of 700 million people that can speak English, the contribution from an educational standpoint, economic standpoint, and all that good stuff, I mean, that's just enormous. So that's where I see, I think, where AI could be very value additive to places like Southeast Asia.
Well, we also had questions come in from online. Unfortunately, we don't have time to address them, but one of the questions was about the future of multilateralism and the role of APEC in it. I expect APEC will continue to function. It serves a purpose of bringing countries and leaders together around a shared agenda, even in places like Vladivostok, which is a testament to the power of the organization, that they can draw that many people to that place. But in any event, please join me in thanking these 4 panelists for a great